Well, welcome everybody. I think we'll get started. We do have a lot to cover today. We're really excited about today's session on banned books. And we want to welcome everyone, especially those of you who have not joined with us before on one of our Zoom tours. This is something that's been really exciting for us. That is a strange sort of happenstance that came out of the pandemic. My name is Eric Chase. If you don't know me, I am the owner of Bootscrape Entertainment that sort of runs these multiple weekly tours that we have, and this particular tour you have here. And I've been the humble owner of this since we started as the Greenwich Village Literary Pub Crawl in 1998. At that time, we were just a fundraiser for a very small theater company, doing readings in bars and weekly tours out in the village. And then as time went on, we became a fundraiser for another small theater company as that one went away. And then soon we were doing private tours and educational tours. And then somewhere around 2012, we found that we were a bit overrun by our competitors. And we were watching as our attendance dropped and we lost attendance in the sea of internet searches and market oversaturation. We started expanding into Brooklyn tours, Times Square tours. We began offering private educational tours, bespoke tours for larger groups, visiting organizations. And then in came the pandemic. At that time, we started introducing these virtual tours. And we found that these tours were really a lot of fun for us because we were no longer limited by how far a person can walk or where the nearest restroom was or a certain geographical area. We could expand our research and we could expand our storytelling. We could regain participation from past guides who had moved on to other areas of the country or the world. And the fact that we could broaden the scope of our tours really helped us invoke some energy and enthusiasm, as the pandemic was obviously a bit of a downer for a handful of us. As they reemerged from the pandemic, we entered an even bigger blight, if you will, from the neighborhood of gentrification. It had been an ongoing problem with the Greenwich Village for really almost 100 years, but it seemed to have sped up out of the pandemic. So we started really just kind of coasting. We were hosting sporadic, occasional tours here and there. We were hosting some of these virtual tours. And it was really tricky trying to figure out whether or not we would actually be able to continue. There were a handful of times I thought about throwing in the towel, and maybe that our time had kind of run its course. But pretty soon we found a new route. We had some new bars. We felt really strong about the material. We began to see an uptick in attendance. The virtual tours were still becoming a big passion project for all of us. And then just recently, Time Out Magazine, bless their hearts, had a wonderful article about us, and we are back to our 2008 levels. We're running weekly tours. We have our non-pub tours going on. So it's really an exciting time for us right now. And it's very rewarding considering just honestly how bleak it felt a few times. That being said, I would love to have the rest of my team unmute their picture. Cameras, whatever you call it these days. I don't know what the kids call it. And welcome everybody. And a big part of why we're even here today is due to these folks, and in particular, Danielle and Becca, who put a lot of energy both in marketing the tour and putting this particular tour together. They've been really wonderful participants and supporters, both of me and the tour. And the fact that anyone is here today is in large part due to them. And I know all of the other guides would say the same. We also have Rose Merritt, who was one of our pandemic additions. She joined up working in the backgrounds. She did a lot to help really kind of formalize what is now our virtual tour setup. She did a lot with our marketing, and we're really excited that she can join us up again today as one of our virtual guides. In my arrangement, right below me is Leo. Leo is a relatively new addition. He joined me on a private tour that we did just a handful of months ago. And he was so exciting for him, he moved to Montana. And he's been out in Montana for a brief period of time, but we're looking forward to having him back on the street with us. But we're excited to have his first virtual guiding experience with us. And then, of course, over to my left is Rachel Grundy, our friend from overseas. She was a longtime guide, actress, musician, and singer. She's joined us on a couple of our virtual tours, and we're really excited to have her back on board. So a quick round of applause to all of them. Thank you for the great materials that they will share, which will be much stronger than the blathering that I will continue to do for 2 more minutes. Banned books. Really excited about this topic. And why banned books? Because these are some of the people and the artists who really kind of pushed the boundaries of what our experiences are. They push the boundaries of the societal mores. They influence so much of the world into where we're at right now. And this is a quick presentation I put, but if you could put the next slide together. Banned books like these here, artists, Nirvana, The Replacements, the punk music. I mean, these are musicians, these are bands that just contributed so much to society. And the fact that there are books to read about them is really fantastic. The next slide here, if you're trying to be a band, there's a banned book that you could read that gives you some tips of how to kind of put it all together. I think this is going to be a really strong read for those of you who also wish to be in a band and have your own banned books. And then, of course, I don't know that there's anything more iconic for a banned book than a banned book about a band called The Band and their book called The Band. If you would go to the next slide here, very strong read. There are The Band Pioneers. So I feel really excited to see what other band. Looking at Becca, and I'm beginning to think that maybe I misread the brief on what this tour was. So maybe I should probably pass this along and see what actually this tour is supposed to be about. Danielle, I think it passed it over to you. I think you have a more accurate aspect of what our band book tour is supposed to be about.
Why, thank you, Eric, for that lovely introduction.
I had to start with a dad joke.
If you're new here and you're not familiar with our humor, we promise it gets better. He talks less. Okay. Comstockery and Patriots. I have to get very serious. This is a serious topic, so I have to put on my glasses. We will begin this evening with a brief history of American book bans. Like most things in America, book bans began with Puritans, specifically Puritans who were naughty. In the 17th century, Puritans sought out to rid America of all books that challenged Puritan beliefs. Today, we would call that puritanical. The first book ban happened in America in 1637 in Quincy, Massachusetts, when Thomas Morton published New English Canon, a critique of Puritanism. The first national book ban in America happened much later in 1852 with Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. The Confederacy removed it from stores due to its pro-abolitionist agenda. In 1873, the Comstock Act, created by Anthony Comstock, enemy of Bohemians everywhere, was enacted by Congress and signed into law by President Grant. It was an anti-vice law banning the mailing and receiving of obscene matter. It did not criminalize obscenity, just the mailing of it via the U.S. Postal Service. So having obscene literature, legal. Sending it to mail to your friend for Christmas, illegal. Even the Canterbury Tales was determined to be too sexy for the mail. The definition of comstockery is strict censorship of materials considered obscene or censorious opposition to alleged immorality, as in literature. Who gets to be the person who decides what is considered obscene and what is considered immoral? The answer they want you to choose is the government. And if something is obscene or immoral, does that mean it has to be censored or banned from the general public? Why does the government get to decide if we are permitted to read? This is the working reasoning that fuels book banning in America to this day. There were several landmark Supreme Court cases regarding censorship, obscenity, the definition of literature, and freedom of speech, including the 1933 case, the United States versus one book called Ulysses, as in James Joyce, and the 1957 case, Roth v. the United States, which redefined the testing for whether a book could be determined to be obscene. In the 1964 case, Jacobellis versus Ohio, Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart stated that the material in the case was not obscene under the Roth test, and it was protected speech. And he determined so by famously writing, "I know it when I see it." I know it when I see it is still the testing criteria for many when they determine whether or not a book should be banned. Throughout the 1970s, there were less book bans as the general culture was more explorative, open, and permissive. However, that changed when President Reagan came into power in the 1980s. Banned Books Week was launched by the American Library Association in 1982 in direct response to this increase of censorship under the Reagan administration. This year, Banned Books Week is held from September 22nd to the 28th, so it's happening right now. Happy Banned Books Week. Thank you for joining us. And you would think that, oh yeah, we'll do a little cheers. Cheers to Banned Book Week.
To banned books.
Yay.
Like the Beatles.
The Who.
Who?
The Patriot Act, enacted in 2001, changed this. You would think that throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, the effort to ban Books Weeks would have made a positive impact, but September 11th changed everything. Enacted in 2001, it allows the government to demand the reading history and activities of library patrons without cause and forbids librarians from disclosing to patrons that they are under investigation. Yes, that is correct. The books you read might be held against you in the court of law. So choose wisely, because your personal FBI agent is definitely judging your beach reads. And that brings us roughly to today. So now that you know a little bit about all the legal history of book bans, we can get into the fun stuff, the literature.
Thank you, Danielle, for putting a touch of fun to sort of a somber material. We're going to see that the reasons for book bannings can be as varied almost as the books themselves. And the more that we've researched, some of the more interesting, quirky, honestly quite surprising these reasons can often be. And in some cases, just the facts of the timings of the bans are somewhat interesting. A book that I think tops the most frequently requested banned book of all time goes to 1984 by George Orwell. Once considered fiction and now considered a major inspiration to some administrations and to Project 2025, it's not surprising that 1984 is on this list. One of the longest running books to have ever been banned actually goes all the way back to 8 BCE to Ovid, who wrote Ars Armatoria, or The Art of Love. It was written in, as I said, 8 BCE. He was banned from Rome for writing it and has continued to be banned over the next 2,000 years. Another unique banning timeline is The Things That They Carried by Tim O'Brien. And it was published in 1990, and it managed to have a nice long run over about 10 years of being in the safe and acceptable literary status before getting added to the list of banned books. And in large part, it was due to pressure and influence from the Pentagon. Why? Well, while it's not necessarily a direct anti-war novel, it's told from such a personal firsthand account, as Tim O'Brien himself was a Vietnam veteran, that the reality and the tragedy brought it down to a personal level for the reader. Beginning with the premise of discussing the unique elements that many soldiers carried with them while they were serving, it brings humanity and the tragic suffering of war to an entire personal and heartfelt perspective. But it was hugely popular, and it is a fantastic read. In fact, it's one of the few books that I started and never put back down until I finished. And I was at a party in a house in Portland, Maine, and every time the crowds came in, I found a quiet room so I could keep reading The Things They're Carried. It is fantastic, both from a literary point of view as well as for the story of the Vietnam experience. But it was 3 major times that it was requested to be banned 10 years later: 2001, 2003, and 2007. Coincidentally enough, 2001 being when we declared war on Afghanistan, 2003 when we declared war on Iraq, and 2007 when General Petraeus requested an additional 20,000 troops to join in the war for Iraq. But the book that we have found that tops the list of the quickest book to ever be banned almost immediately after publication, at least here in the US, is the classic Steinbeck tale, Grapes of Wrath.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah.
You're welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. So regarded as one of the great American novels, when The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck was published in 1939, it simultaneously received critical acclaim, huge commercial success, and was vehemently denounced as everything from profane and vulgar to dangerously communist. So Steinbeck, who, by the way, I think in this picture looks like the kind of guy that every wannabe rustic hipster wishes he looked like. Just my personal opinion. But Steinbeck was famous for highlighting the struggles of the poor, the dispossessed, and the underrepresented. And he believed that literature should challenge dominant narratives of the culture. So in The Grapes of Wrath, we follow one family, the Joads, who are forced to leave Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl after their farm is taken by the bank. And a quick primer on the Dust Bowl for folks. In the 1930s, when folks were struggling with the effects of the Wall Street crash and the resulting Great Depression, the Great Plains region, you can see on this map, also experienced severe droughts, leading to intense dust storms and crop failures. This region had been over-cultivated for grain farming since World War I, causing mass erosion of the topsoil and loss of the natural ecosystem. Present-day studies estimate that some 1.2 billion tons of soil were lost across 100 million acres of the Great Plains just between 1934 and 1935, which was the drought's most severe period. So in the book, faced with starvation and homelessness, the Jodes do what is estimated 400,000 people did during this time. They headed west to California in search of migrant farm jobs, lured by handbills printed all over the Midwest, promising a land of plenty. And here's how Steinbeck describes these events in The Grapes of Wrath. And then the dispossessed were drawn west, from Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, from Nevada and Arkansas, families, tribes, dusted out, tracted out, carloads, caravans, homeless and hungry, 20,000 and 50,000 and 100,000 and 200,000. They streamed over the mountains, hungry and restless as ants scurrying to find work to do, to lift, to push, to pick, to cut, anything, any burden to bear for food. The kids are hungry. We got no place to live. Like ants scurrying for work, for food, and most of all, for land. So Steinbeck had spent several years covering the migrant labor camps in California, where many of those dispossessed people went in search of work. And when they got there, they faced exploitation, starvation wages, squalid living conditions, and no protections. Seeing this firsthand, reporting for the San Francisco News, Steinbeck's anger was evident when he sat down to write this novel. And he said, quote, "I want to put a tag of shame on the greedy bastards who are responsible for this. I've done my damnedest to rip a reader's nerves to rags." So although he spent many years on this research, Steinbeck actually wrote the whole 619-page novel longhand in a notebook in just 5 months. And his first wife, Carol, who suggested the title actually from the famous song Battle Hymn of the Republic, typed up the manuscript. And when it was published, it was the best-selling book of 1939, with more than 430,000 copies printed by February of 1940, and it led to a movie that same year starring Henry Fonda, which was nominated for 7 Academy Awards. I will note that the movie significantly alters the ending, and it omits one of the most stark scenes in the book, which is the very last scene with Rose of Sharon and a starving man.
Yeah.
But conversely, there was huge criticism of the book and various bans and book burnings around the country for a wide variety of reasons. And there were your usual run-of-the-mill censorship themes. It uses profane language, there's sexually explicit content, yada, 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 yawn. However, the most fervent attacks came from the Associated Farmers of California. They hated the book's depiction of California farmers' attitudes and conduct towards the migrants. And they denounced the book as a, quote, pack of lies and labeled it, quote, communist propaganda. So this famous photo from Kern County, California, where the Jodes spend time in the book, shows a local worker called Clell Pruitt burning a copy of The Grapes of Wrath as Bill Camp and another leader of the Associated Farmers stand by. And at the time this photograph was taken, Clell Pruitt had not read the novel. The Associated Farmers were a large and influential group in the area, and due to their efforts, the Kern County Board of Supervisors banned The Grapes of Wrath from county libraries and schools. But meanwhile, local librarian Gretchen Neef-Schenk was working quietly to get the ban overturned. At the risk of losing her job, she stood up to the county supervisors and wrote a letter asking them to reverse their decision. In the letter, she said, "It's such a vicious and dangerous thing to begin. Besides, banning books is so utterly hopeless and futile. Ideas don't die because a book is forbidden reading. If Steinbeck has written the truth, that truth will survive." Too right, Gretchen. So while the ban remained for a year and a half, the censorship of The Grapes of Wrath would actually be a key factor in the creation of the Library Bill of Rights by the American Library Association in 1939. So the original adoption of the Library Bill of Rights was introduced with this statement, quote, "Today, indications in many parts of the world point to growing intolerance, suppression of free speech, and censorship affecting the rights of minorities and individuals," unquote, which was a reference to the emergence of totalitarian states during that time in the late 30s. So, little did the Associated Farmers know that their initial success in banning this book would lead to the creation of a Library Bill of Rights to protect free speech and access to literature free of censorship. So take that, Bill Camp. So I'm going to leave you with this quote from Gretchen Neve Schenk, which feels as relevant today as it was in her time, and I'm really inspired by learning about her. And she said, "If that book is banned today, what will be banned tomorrow? And what group will want a book banned the day after that?" Wise words.
Very nice. Very nice.
Yeah.
Once again, you make me wonder, are there any people who are cooler than librarians?
Right? I
You know,
mean,
I
go
no,
ahead.
you're say no, no, you. No, I was going to say that I had read an interesting fact with Steinbeck because we used to talk about him back when we went to Chumley's and how
Mhm.
he had made several trips back and forth driving
Yep.
across the country, and he would just see the condition of so many of these people on the road, and that was part of what really inspired him to write Grapes of Wrath, among other
Mhm.
novels. I
Yeah.
also really love how just bucolic your cat is, curled up in the chair behind you, sleeping. I mean, it just really creates a very homey feel to this
Yeah.
tour. So thank
Yeah.
you for your cat and for you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, he's very busy right now, as you can tell. So
Now, it's kind of interesting because you mentioned the Associated Farmers, because another sort of favorite theme when it comes to banning is sort of the financial theme, and the status of the financial wealth of many of our U.S. industries. Finance does indeed come into play when it comes to banning a book. Now, just by saying that, I'm sure that already many of you were wondering why we haven't already mentioned this next author, especially when you think about finance influencing an author who is rife with controversy, political activism, profanity, lewd writings, and of course, as we all know, you can go ahead and say it with me, the author is Dr. Seuss. In particular, the deeply offensive novel The Lorax, which is commonly referred to as the lewd Lorax. Just kidding. Oh, that was so well timed, Becca. I have not seen these slides of this. The Lorax, if you haven't read it or seen the animated movie, is a book decrying the deforestation of the modern world and how modern progress is horrible for nature. And that wasn't particularly popular with the logging industry. And so they made many attempts to kind of ban the Lorax to keep kids from thinking about nature. But of course, there is a much more iconic novel that really deals with what life was like in early industrial America. And it's based on a working class novelist who grew up poor in the working class, as I just said, and saw much of this firsthand. And Rose, I think it's best if you take it from here.
Thanks, Eric. And you know what? Just to step back a little bit, I'm gonna try not to take it as a personal affront that when I left the tour for a little while over the last year and a half, numbers picked up. But whatever. I mean,
Completely
knock wood.
unrelated.
Please stay on this call. I'm sorry I'm here, everyone. As Eric said, we're going to move from the struggles of the working poor in the country, as Rachel was talking about, to the struggles of the working poor in the city. Upton Sinclair was born in Baltimore in 1878. His family moved around due to his father's inability to find stable work, and they finally settled in Queens, New York. He attended City College, then Columbia Law School, but ultimately he was drawn to writing. Now, a little fun fact. Did you know that Bill Nye, yes, the Bill Nye, the science guy, played Upton Sinclair in David Fincher's fairly recent film Mank? That's enough about that for now, but we may touch on it a little bit later. So, getting back to Sinclair, he wrote over 100 books during his life. Bit of a show off. But most famously, of course, was The Jungle. First serialized in the liberal-leaning newspaper Appeal to Reason in 1905. It was published by Doubleday in 1906, the following year. The book exposed labor abuses and unsanitary conditions in Chicago's meat packing industry around the turn of the century. It also detailed the poor living conditions of the workers, many of whom were immigrants, their meager existence, the dilapidated tenements they inhabited, and their struggles to survive. But oddly enough, I suppose it was the gathering together of these workers and their efforts to actually improve their conditions that pissed people off. In truth, somewhat surprisingly, the jungle has not been banned on a wide scale. It was banned in Chicago, as would be expected, and Boston for some reason. Early on in the 20th century, the Nazis went further and burned it. It was on that burn pile. And several other countries have banned it over the course of its history. At the time itself, President Teddy Roosevelt called him a, quote, crackpot for his socialist ideas, holding him in contempt and alleging his observations were exaggerated. Congress only acted to present reform legislation for factory conditions after conducting an inspection of their own, which, even despite a factory cleanup by the management, confirmed the conditions Sinclair had described to be no exaggeration. Not to be forgotten, Senator Joseph McCarthy, later on in the century, hated Sinclair and the book, of course. And in the end, some contents have been edited out over time. It's a little unclear what those are. There was a recent republication of the full, unvarnished version of The Jungle, and I invite you to read that. But this editing was an attempt to shield audiences from some of its very strongly socialist messages such as, one of the necessary accompaniments of capitalism in a democracy is political corruption, and one of the consequences of civic administration by ignorant and vicious politicians is that preventable diseases kill off half our population. And even if science were allowed to try, it could do little because the majority of human beings are not yet human beings at all, but simply machines for the creating of wealth for others. They're penned up in filthy houses and left to rot and stew in misery. And the conditions of their life make them ill faster than all the doctors in the world could heal them. For this reason, I would seriously maintain that all the medical and surgical discoveries that science can make in the future will be of less importance than the application of the knowledge we already possess when the disinherited of the earth have established their right to a human existence. And he also described how the fallacy of capitalism crept into the minds of the workers themselves, undermining their own well-being in the process. He wrote, you'd begin talking to some poor devil who had worked in one shop for the last 30 years and had never been able to save a penny, who left his home every morning at 6 o'clock to go and tend a machine and come back at night too tired to take his clothes off, who'd never had a week's vacation in his life, had never traveled, never had an adventure, never learned anything, never hoped anything. And when you started to tell him about socialism, he'd sniff and say, I'm not interested in that. I'm an individualist. And then he would go on to tell you that socialism was paternalism, and that if it ever had its way, the world would stop progressing. For how many millions of such poor deluded wretches there were, whose lives had been so stunted by capitalism that they no longer knew what freedom was. And they really thought that it was individualism for tens of thousands of them to herd together and obey the orders of a steel magnate and produce hundreds of millions of dollars of wealth for him, and then let him give them libraries. While for them to take the industry and run it to suit themselves and build their own libraries, that would have been paternalism. The title itself was a reference to the state of capitalism, a jungle, a frenzy of the overworked and underpaid, the poor, the weak, and the sick, vulnerable at any moment to the whims of the super rich. Sinclair was outspoken in his views throughout his career. He was described by Time magazine as a man with every gift except humor and silence. After moving to California in the 1920s, he founded that state's chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. He continued to participate actively in labor agitation. In 1923, in fact, while participating in a labor strike, he began to read from the Bill of Rights and was promptly arrested, along with hundreds of others, by the LAPD. The arresting officer proclaimed, "We'll have none of that Constitution stuff." Many of his books took direct aim at titans of capitalism: William Randolph Hearst in in the Brass Check, Henry Ford in The Flivver King, and John D. Rockefeller in King Cole. But as promised, getting back to David Fincher's Mank, the film suggests actually that Herman Mankiewicz was inspired to write the screenplay for Citizen Kane, famously suspected to be based on William Randolph Hearst, after an unsuccessful gubernatorial run by Sinclair in California in 1934. Hence, Bill Nye. There you go. Now, I read The Jungle when I was 16 on my own. I have a distinct memory of being the nerd that I was, ignoring my classmates and reading the chapter where he describes the stomach churning process of the massacre of the cattle while at a Cece's Pizza, eating pepperoni pizza. There you go. But I loved the idea of a muckraker being a tireless evangelist for improving the lives of others. One wonders, without the jungle, how long would it have taken for the government and the public to pay attention? Time for something a bit lighter, I guess. I'll turn it back to you, Eric.
Well, thank you. That was very well done, and I love that you have a picture of you at the gravesite. That personal connection sometimes is really what I love that we bring to something like this. The jungle. Well, I guess it is a little lighter to this next bit, and I like to lead into it because this is a type of a band that I like to call the got nothing better to do band, aka the teen band, if you will. And this one, I have to admit, also makes me a little proud because I have a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old daughter who have read a banned book, and that makes me proud. If I told the girls, I had no idea there was anything worth banning in it. If I had asked them told them that it was banned, they would have simply asked why. Raina Telgemeier has written several graphic novels that are really wonderful, huge hits. They're great for young people, especially with younger girls. Her books Smile, Guts, and Sisters all deal with growing up as a girl, dealing with family issues, sibling rivalries, finding your own space, getting comfortable in your own skin, finding your own identity, dealing with anxieties, basically navigating the world and the modern world as an anxious child, like all of us were at one point. And she really does it in such a way that kind of brings you in and helps you connect with it. And so I'm actually was really glad that my girls latched onto this because I felt like it's a very positive influence to it. As I read them, even aloud, I kind of got drawn into some of the characters myself. She wrote another book called Drama. Now, this one is particularly my favorite, and probably because I was a theater kid in high school and in college. And it follows the character of Callie. Now, she joins the local school theater club, but she's not a performer. She's not comfortable being up there, but she joins as a stage crew, which, again, I have a certain fondness for. And it follows her as she sort of navigates through life and love, friendship, and theater, all in a high school setting. She's tasked with trying to come up with a Broadway-esque style scene moment with a cannon that fires. But of course, she doesn't have a Broadway budget. She has a high school theater club budget, which is zip. So much of the play, you just see her tenacity as she pushes through and tries to make this work. You see her deal with the stress of it not working and the pressure she's putting on herself, as most stress, especially as a young person, is something that's self-imposed, if you will. How she continues to be persistent, how she has a desire to execute to the best of her ability. Also, while she's trying to deal with her own romantic situations and trying to deal with love and affection and embarrassment of such love. Now, all of this, as I described, you're like, why would this be banned? Well, it's banned because there happens to be two small side characters that are gay. One who is outwardly gay and one who is struggling with coming to terms to his own sexuality. And of course, just the fact that there is an existence of gay people in a school, especially that young, is obviously the impetus to have this ban. Now, I will say that neither of my daughters, after they read this, had any questions about like what is homosexuality or what is sexuality and what is love, and they had no questions of anything like that. They just asked where the next book about flying dragons, and they put together a puzzle about the different types of animal poop. So they just were kids reading kids. And I think the fear for some people is that it normalizes something, and that is really the fear of those who are trying to ban it. But really, and if you read it, it's very profound how she is learning how to deal with rejection, especially when it's rejection for someone who just has no attraction back to her. And I think that's something that all of us as kids and as teenagers at one point or other can experience. Now, Leo has taken this theme in a very interesting way with a novel that has been banned many times with The Great Gatsby, but I think I guess you've kind of found a new reason that people have missed. Am I right, Leo?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the first reason that it's banned that a lot of people don't know about is there's a lot of anti-cowboy rhetoric going around the country right now. And if you go to the next slide, people don't know that Fitzgerald actually had a big cowboy career. So that's been a lot of the bans, actually.
Underground cowboy.
Yeah, he was not open with it at all. But thanks, yeah. The Great Gatsby has been challenged frequently since its publication in 1925, with two of the most notable challenges being those by Baptist College in Charleston, South Carolina, back in 1987, and by Matanuska-Susitna School District in Palmer, Alaska in 2020. Both of those challenges mainly had to do with the character of Tom Buchanan cheating on his wife, Daisy Buchanan, with the character of Myrtle Wilson. Now, I think it's pretty ironic that both of these challenges focus on this detail and flat out ignore the scene in which Nick Carraway, the narrator, has sex with a man. Towards the beginning of the book, Nick and Tom are drinking with Myrtle and a group of her friends. One of these friends is the shy, soft-spoken photographer McKee. Nick and McKee leave the party together around midnight, and the following unedited exchange occurs. "Come to lunch someday," McKee suggested as we groaned down in the elevator. "Where?" "Anywhere." "Keep your hands off the lever," snapped the elevator boy. "I beg your pardon," said Mr. McKee with dignity. "I didn't know I was touching it." "All right," I agreed. "I'll be glad to." I was standing beside his bed and he was sitting up between the sheets, clad in his underwear with a great portfolio in his hands. "Beauty and the Beast," "Loneliness," "Old Grocery Horse," "Brooklyn Bridge." Then I was lying half asleep in the cold lower level of the Pennsylvania station, staring at the Morning Tribune and waiting for the 4 o'clock train. Now, amazingly, this passage was almost entirely ignored by Gatsby scholars until Keith Fraser commented on it in the really poorly titled 1979 essay called Another Reading of the Great Gatsby, in which he calls it evidence of what is typical of Fitzgerald treatment of sex in the novel, which is its ambiguity. But the passage started to gain more attention in the 80s and 90s. Francis Kerr largely agreed with Fraser and also extended his focus on ambiguity to also discuss the role of gender in the text. Edward Wasiolik, on the other hand, had nothing to do with the ambiguity bit and instead saw the scene as blatant quote-unquote evidence that Nick is gay. And there is definitely something to be said about how explicitly non-hetero the passage reads in retrospect. The two men sitting next to each other undressed, the missing 4 hours between the time they leave the party and the time Nick wakes up in Penn Station, and, of course, the phallic intrusion of the elevator lever into Nick and McKee's conversation. It all seems so explicit that when I was first thinking about what I was going to say about the stupidity of banning The Great Gatsby, I was almost content to leave it there. These people want to ban Gatsby for being too sexual, but these people clearly haven't read the book, because it's not just sexual, it's gay too. But as much as I love dunking on fascists with poor reading comprehension, I love The Great Gatsby more. And while leaving it there might be funny, I would miss the opportunity to talk about how the ambiguities that Baptist College missed out on actually play a huge part in what is so magical about the book, and why, in my opinion, it is absolutely something students and especially teenagers should read. So, some teenagers actually are gay. I know that might sound shocking to a lot of you, but it's true. And queer representation in fiction is absolutely essential to creating environments in which queer youth feel comfortable exploring their identities. By being able to identify a queer main character in a book that is unquestionably considered the great American novel, queer youth feel a sense of belonging to a wider American cultural and historical milieu from which queer histories are normally excluded. But I'm arguing that this book is an essential read for all teenagers. So in lieu of saying that this book deserves a spot on school curricula simply because it features a queer main character in a historically significant novel. I'm instead going to offer you two truths that you can apply to all teenagers in the United States. So, truth number one, American teenagers are uncertain about their identities. And truth number two, American teenagers are incessant self-mythologizers. Now, polling any high school in the country, you will certainly find teenagers who identify as gay. But what you probably won't find are any teenagers who feel absolutely 100% comfortable in their own skin. And here we have some great pictures of all of our lovely hosts as teenagers. You can see being a teenager is very hard. But teenagers are in the
I was not a teenager in that picture.
Because Eric was
I
actually
looked younger
14.
as a teenager. I am misrepresented here.
As you can see, teenagers are in the uniquely uncomfortable position of claiming an identity for the first time and that process involves a lot of trial and error. But at the same time, a huge part of this process of figuring out who you are is telling stories about yourself and telling them confidently, proclaiming out loud that this is who I am, Mom, and it is not a phase. Sometimes this happens in public, sometimes in the privacy of your own bedroom, but in either case, becoming an adult person means imagining the person you're going to be, imagining that person's story, and thinking deeply about how well that story resonates with all of the feelings rolling around inside of you. Now, as a card-carrying former American teenager, I can say this need to think about your story as it happens is especially pressing in America, a country where images of joyful youth are constantly sold to us through our media. Now, Fitzgerald wrote Gatsby at a time when those images were being formulated for the very first time. Technological advancements, changing social mores, and the rise of the American middle class meant that much of the leisure activities that were previously enjoyed primarily by the upper class were being practiced by more and more people, including teenagers, in increasingly public settings. The idea that your youth should look and feel a certain way, and the pressure to perform that youth in public, that was just being invented in the 1920s. Now, there can't be any better example of these social changes than at Jay Gatsby's famous parties, where vast swaths of people from a variety of ethnic backgrounds gather in Gatsby's garish, new construction mansion to drink, fool around, and listen to Vladimir Tolstoy's Jazz History of the World, in plain view of the disapproving old money East Eggers like Tom Buchanan. Young Nick Carraway doesn't know what to make of these displays. He spends the entire book coping with, considering, and reconsidering the legend of Jay Gatsby. Is Gatsby the American dream incarnate, a man who worked hard for his money and made it to the top? Or is he an imposter, a thief and a gambler, pretending to be something that the poor, Midwestern James Gatz never could be? For readers, Nick Carraway himself is subject to this same ambiguity and uncertainty. And this is where those ellipses in Nick's encounter with McKee become so magical. It is certainly possible that Nick has sex with McKee, just as it's possible to read The Great Gatsby and come away with the interpretation that Nick is in love with Jay Gatsby. But what's more important than any quote-unquote evidence of these things is the fact that the book provides the readers so many opportunities to wonder about them. What happens in those 4 missing hours? What amazing things happen during the many hours of Gatsby's parties that Fitzgerald does not describe? What is it about Gatsby that inspires such unceasing loyalty in Nick? In The Great Gatsby, young American readers encounter, often for the first time, a world whose greatness isn't simply given to them, but is instead offered to them as something that they get to create. And this world can be one in which queerness runs through the very heart of great American fiction. I like to think that this is why all of the groups who have banned this book failed to notice the scene between Nick and McKee. They lacked that same strength of imagination, which makes The Great Gatsby and all of the students who read and wonder about it so special.
Very nicely done, Leo. Thank you. Leo's first participation as a virtual guide, everybody. That was really well put together. And I do love that it gave room for people to wonder. So that's a great line. Well done. This kind of leads us now into what I like to refer to as the Quirky Band, or sometimes we like to call the For Real. And this kind of goes back, this quirky attempt by the Anchorage School Board in 1987 to ban the American Heritage Dictionary. Yes, the dictionary. In fact, if the news articles are true to this day, Florida has also made attempts to pull it from the shelves. But the dictionary, yes. Why? Well, because it included some objectionable words, slang words like bed, or, and forgive me if you were faint of heart here, knocker, or balls. Balls. And
Well done, Becca. Bravo.
You're welcome.
Good.
God. Oh, I don't know where your mind was going, but clearly my mind is going to balls. Thank you. Yes. Revenge, Becca. Revenge is
Oh
mine.
no. What have I done?
Oh. But I can't think of any other novel that might have quirkiness as a better descriptor, and more quirky attempts to ban than this next one that Becca is going to share with us. Thank you.
My pleasure, Eric. Okay, so I've chosen a book that I think is very special because similar to what Leo was saying and a lot of the other themes that have come up tonight. It's a book that challenges us as humans in a most playful and whimsical way to question the sometimes nonsensical rules that are bestowed upon us in the world. It's a book that brought us vivid characters such as the Cheshire Cat and the Mad Hatter and the fearsome Jabberwock, penned by notable mathematician and lover of logic, Charles L. Dodgson, or you might know him better as Lewis Carroll. Now, I'm certain that many of you have read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, or at least you've seen the 1951 Disney classic, and at its core, it's a coming-of-age story. It's full of all of this wonderful, delicious wordplay, offering an imaginative glimpse into a young girl's psyche as she navigates all these strict expectations of women in a Victorian society. And it's how she makes sense of the world around her that is often strange and confusing, and I think that speaks to the human condition. And it's moments like these where Alice asks herself, who in the world am I? Ah, that is the great puzzle. And then when her feet grow too long, she exclaims, oh, my poor little feet. I wonder who will put on your shoes and stockings for you now, dears. I am sure I shan't be able. I love those. Now, the story was inspired by a real-life experience in which Carol entertained the Liddell sisters, and they were daughters of the dean at Christ Church in Oxford, one of whom was the namesake of the books, Alice. She has the little cropped in the hat, if you're wondering which one she is. Now, Carol was frequently implored by the children to tell these fantastical stories during boating trips, and on one particular lazy golden afternoon in 1862, this book came to be. He later wrote it down for Alice as a Christmas present, and at the behest of his colleagues and friends, got it published in 1865. Now, despite its charms and the great praise and pleasure it brings, the book has been challenged every few decades since its publication, and the reasons for which are as numerous as they are puzzling at times, and ironically tend to contradict many of the key tenets that can be gleaned from the story itself. Okay, so why was Alice banned? Now, the first challenge dates back to 1900, where the books were banned in New Hampshire for this whole long laundry list of wrongdoings, most of which I think are more so the result
of imposing a contemporary lens on how Carroll lived his life and not based on anything in the text itself, except for his satirization of tyrannical figures who would probably also just jump on the bandwagon of banning books. Now, in the 1930s, Alex got the boot in China for talking animals. While in the Western world, we find them whimsical and delightful, they are seen as an affront to human dignity over there, which is, of course, reflecting deeper cultural sensitivities about anthropomorphism generally. Now, that brings us to the 1960s, where the most volatile bans and challenges erupted as a result of that pesky caterpillar just smoking his hookah on a magical mushroom, inspiring people with fervor to ban the book for being drug propaganda. Now, for many of you, I'm sure that the Jefferson Airplane song comes to mind, plus plenty of bizarre and trippy adaptations of the novel. And if you've ever seen the 1933 version, the adaptation, it is unnerving, and you might be inclined to agree with some of the bans. And yes, that really is Cary Grant as the Mock Turtle, which is wild. But the 1960s were, of course, marked by significant cultural and social upheaval, including the rise of the psychedelic drug revolution, which I think that kind of distorted some of the more whimsical and surreal elements of Alice into one big metaphor for just doing drugs. Now, while opium, I will say, was a very big problem in Victorian times and looking back, highly problematic, there is no evidence in the text itself to support the glorification or promotion of drug use or any evidence of Lewis Carroll partaking in it himself. Now, while the tales certainly inspired countless iconic movements and adaptations, these bans were less about Carroll's intentions or anything in the text and more a reflection of societal anxieties. And for me, herein lies the problem. When reading texts solely through a contemporary lens, we lack context, and in many cases, I think we lack compassion. By censoring literature in this way, we miss out on the chance to learn both from the past as well as from any experiences that digress outside of that little box of current social norms. So what I found fascinating in my research is that some of these psychedelic associations that people picked up on may more likely stem not from drugs, but from Carroll's own health challenges. This is just throwing a little compassion out there for you. Now, in the Victorian times, disabilities were often regarded with great suspicion, and they were stigmatized, and they were seen as divine punishment rather than any medical condition requiring treatment or understanding. And from a young age, Carroll struggled with a debilitating stammer. The Dodo character in the books is actually a self-deprecating nod to himself and his difficulty in pronouncing his real last name, Dodgson. What started as what he referred to as a hesitation evolved into regular blackouts, visual aberrations, such as seeing auras, and modern scholars believe that he actually had undiagnosed epilepsy, suffering seizures for his entire life. Now, it could be argued that the Alice books reflect how Carroll adjusted to his own neurologically induced Wonderland, mirroring his own distorted reality, rather than focusing on drug allegations or building a manifesto for Timothy Leary. I think we could view Alice as a guide for navigating the challenges of growing up and offering insights not just for children, but for any human being who is struggling to find their place in the world that doesn't accept them. Now, at the end of the day, while some adults may interpret the tales through a more cynical lens, and forget to appreciate it as a captivating adventure aimed at offering sanctuary, I think Alice's Adventures in Wonderland serves as both a fun, playful celebration of childlike wonder and imagination, and also a reminder for us to be kind both to ourselves and to others, especially when the world feels a little weird. So I say we raise a glass or a teacup, whatever floats your boat, to the whimsical absurdity and the imaginative spirit of Wonderland, and to not be afraid to challenge authority and ask questions. And I'm going to use a little bit of quotes for a toast for us. Okay, so here is to keeping the simple and loving heart of childhood, to being curiouser and curiouser, and to making eyes bright and eager with many a strange tale. Cheers.
Cheers. Very well put together, Becca. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Inspiring. It's like, what, are we taking classes to be a writer or something?
I don't know, maybe. Thinking about it. I'm practicing.
That was lovely and a good tell of the story.
Thank
So,
you.
as we're nearing the end, one of the other bands that sort of come up with it was interesting to me, that I wanted to mention. I'm kind of calling it the surprise band because I was kind of surprised at what I learned from here, and it comes from the much heralded novel of To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Now, I'm not saying that the fact that it was getting banned is necessarily surprising. I think most of us would expect that for most of the normal reasons. Vulgarity, use of racial slurs, talk of sexuality are often the culprits. We've heard them throughout today's presentation. And usually comes down to a root of trying to suppress a certain cultural guilt, a denial of history, and downplay the harshness of slavery and the past and present forms of racism. It's something we still see now. I mean, history is uncomfortable, and often we struggle on how to come to terms with the reality of history and the blending of that with a sense of patriotic pride and the many inspiring things that also come from our history. And that duality is a difficult balance to ride, and so that's expected. We even now see dramatic pushes to deny and downplay the teaching of slavery in schools. This in museums for slavery in Alabama and in schools in Florida, you're seeing how they're teaching that slavery was a mixed blessing and that it actually taught some skills to people that they could benefit their personal lives. The good. Let's focus on the good qualities of slavery. Personal benefit, mixed blessings. But the surprise for me when it comes to Kill a Mockingbird was the number of African American families that were making requests to ban the book. One family in the 1980s suggested that it represented institutional racism under the guise of good literature. There have been concerns raised about the burden that its racist language puts on Black students in today's culture. That kind of feels like a white complaint as well, but there's also been critics that say the novel really kind of focuses on this white savior theme that is also a complaint in a lot of modern literature and movies. But I read the book when I was in my late 20s, much later than I should have, to be honest. And I was absolutely blown away. I mean, I think it's been described as the greatest American novel, and I think it really could hold that title. Until recently, it was really the only book she ever published. In 2015, almost posthumously, was published the novel Ghost Set a Watchman, which was actually written before To Kill a Mockingbird, but it's sort of considered to be a sequel now in a weird way, with the aspects of what happened after the trial. I haven't read it, so I can't really speak to it, but I can say if you haven't read To Kill a Mockingbird, I think every American student, in my mind, should. And so this is where it kind of becomes interesting to me, because when I read it, I obviously read it from my own perspective of a white middle-class male. And I found it to be very, inspiring and thought-provoking and put a real sense of reality to our history. But in hearing all the, some of the African American complaints and that side, it made me wonder, like, maybe I should read it again and read it trying to think about somebody else's perspective and how someone else who's not me would view that novel, which again kind of holds up the irony that the fact that there were so many attempts to ban it makes me want to read it again. So a little bit of irony in all of that. But I think from there, Danielle, you've kind of got some more interesting summations here on the different types of other books that have been banned and why.
Yes, thank you, Eric. Now that we've done our tour with a couple of stories of literature, we're going to head back to today. So now that you're informed about a couple of books, I really want to have a full-on discussion about what is happening right now in this Banned Books Week in 2024. So PEN America recorded over 10,000 instances of book bans between 2021 to 2023 alone. In comparison, in 2014, only 235 book bans occurred. So that's a huge increase.
Wow.
And Florida and Texas are the states with the highest amount of bans. Many of these bans began at the local level as countywide bans for either libraries or school districts and have since moved up to the state level. Organized groups are demanding the censorship of sometimes hundreds of books at a time, which makes it impossible for local councils to determine the merit of these requests individually and results in total bans. This is called paperwork terrorism. A study by the Washington Post found that between 2021 to 2022, only 11 people were responsible for 60% of the book bans. Mommies of tyranny, I'm looking right at you. Some states have responded by creating restricted sections of the library. Now, I personally know that this works really well because when I was a teen, I moved from a town with an unrestricted library to a town with a restricted section, and all of my beloved witch books were all in the restricted section, and they were locked away. And that was really successful in stopping me from growing up and becoming a witch. So thank you for
I'm
that.
glad it was effective. Yeah, that was.
Yeah, super effective. In Idaho, new legislation forced libraries to create new tiers of library cards for minors. An unfortunate result, which made news, was one mother who signed off for an unrestricted library card for her child, but she herself was not permitted into the library because she was holding a newborn that didn't have a library card. It's really dumb, right? And most of the books that are included in these bans, including the books that we discussed tonight, are not necessarily excessively pornographic or violent. But did you know that there is a children's book that includes prostitution, adultery, eunuchs, and bestiality? And this book has been omitted from almost all current bans. Let me read you a passage, and you're going to decide whether or not this is obscene. There she lusted after her lovers, whose genitals were like those of donkeys, and whose emission was like that of horses. So you longed for the lewdness of your youth, when in Egypt your bosom was caressed. In Egypt, your bosom was caressed, and your young breasts fondled. Young breasts. It's great, right? Does anyone know what salacious book this is from? Is it from Black Beauty, the original Mr. Ed, Shrek, Magic Treehouse, Mummies in the Morning, or the Bible?
Rose, forgive me for being political here, but I feel like we're looking at an image of the 2016 debates, presidential debates there. I mean, am I right?
It will haunt your dreams.
Oh my goodness, what is with that?
Terrifying, right?
Yeah.
Have you
Please
watched
tell me
it?
it's on. I really hope it's on YouTube. Is it on YouTube?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, definitely.
Go watch it and just like live in your worst nightmares.
It's so disturbing.
It was apparently so bad too, they were worried about the Wizard of Oz being crazy as well. Because it came just before. Yeah.
There's that, no, Leo. There's that super disturbing like second Wizard of Oz movie that I watched from the library. I took it out and haunts my dreams to this day. I do not recommend.
Return to Oz is terrifying.
Yeah, that one, the one with the guy and the hands and
with the wheelers and stuff.
I don't recommend.
It's very scary.
Okay, so we feel like we gave you like a second to do the poll, and the longer we stay, the more terrifying your background. The answer to it is the Bible. So in Mobile, Alabama, this discussion about the Bible is currently happening right now. Like just last month, this hit the news. Due to Alabama's current culture wars regarding book bans, Mobile City Councilman William Carroll used this exact example of the Bible to illustrate the dangers of censorship. And the same conversation has happened in Utah, Texas, Florida, Kansas, and Virginia. There is this misbelief that libraries are places of curation, that they pick and choose which books are appropriate and valuable to a community and share them. But this is not the case. Libraries are a place of record. In other libraries, books like Read Me a Story, Stella have also been included in the bans. Now, if you're not familiar with this extremely obscene children's book, it's part of an 11-book series. In this particular story, a pair of siblings read books and build a doghouse. And it's deeply offensive because the author is a gay. No, the author isn't gay. She is literally a gay, as in her last name is gay. And that's it. That's the whole offense. This isn't a product of a real moral concern about the media children consume. Yet through all of these bans, there is one book that has somehow escaped the cut. And I am so deeply bewildered and confused and disturbed by this book that, of course, the first time I walked past it in an aisle in Target, I knew it when I saw it that I had to own it. And this book is I Need a New Butt by Don Macmillan. Please ban this book. I beg you. No, I'm just kidding. I don't believe in book bans. And I don't even feel safe about kidding about this book because in Hinds County, Mississippi, yes, Hinds County, Assistant Principal Toby Price was actually fired from his job for reading this book. That's right. He was fired for reading a children's book to children. It is obvious that many parents want children to only have access to their own world vision and not the world as it is in actuality. But what I want to know is, how do parents, administrators, and government officials think that they can ban books from students when most of these students have access to the internet right in their backpack? Censorship leaves us in the dark, and by enacting legislation to ban books that you personally may think is obscene or immoral because you know it when you see it, that same legislation that you advocated for that grants the government permission to decide what you can or can't read will most likely in the near future be used against you as well.
Thank you, Danielle. So some really fun stuff here. Really fun presentations. Thank you, everybody. We're going to wrap up real quickly, but I did feel like I just wanted to make one call out because of all of the reasons that have been used to ban a book, there's one that had it all. Had every reason. It was lewd. It was profane. It's got sex. It's got straight sex, gay sex, weird sex, unheard of sex. It's got violence. It's got racism, sexism. It's got body horror. It's got drugs. It has a talking anus. I mean, the one thing that it does not have is a plot. And of course, I am talking about Naked Lunch. A strange and bizarre experiment, if you will, by William S. Burroughs, has everything but plot. Now, I've read it. I'm not exactly sure that I can tell you what it was about. I guess it's like some short stories, or what's been described more accurately as non-linear routines. And I love that. And I think it's the best way to describe anything. I now want to write, as an author, a collection of non-linear routines. It's set in a fictional city called Interzone, and it follows the main character, who is, no surprise here for Burroughs fans, an opium addict. But I think I wouldn't recommend the book, but I would recommend this movie that you see here that it was inspired by the book with Peter Weller and Ian Holm. And actually, it's sort of a cult classic favorite of mine from college and probably the best result that came out of it. Now, there was an attempt to ban, and this ban, they fought it all the way up to the Massachusetts Supreme Court. It's been defended by Allen Ginsberg, of course, who was very active in anti-banning court cases, as well as Norman Mailer, among many others. And in a landmark decision, it was allowed to continue to exist because it had literary merit. And there you go. Literary merit. The two greatest words of the Beat movement, the two greatest words of any literary artist now. I kind of feel like there are a lot of memoirs and autobiographies written over the last few years that I might argue lack literary merit, but who am I? I'm just some guy. But there you go. You want a future in writer? You want to write something profane? Just make sure it has literary merit. And with that, thank you very much for joining us. We do really, really appreciate it. If you've never been on one of our tours, I hope that you will someday join one of our tours. And if you've been on one of our tours and you've joined us here now, we hope you'll join for many more. What was that? What was that?
It was competition for your teenager picks, and it was your final remarks.
You know, there actually are pictures that exist of me when I was a teenager.
I didn't know they had cameras then.
We are on all of your favorite social media sites. Well, actually, I don't know if we're on all of them anymore, but your Facebooks and your Twitters and your it's not Twitter anymore, right? It's X. Substack, which I'm a personal favorite of Substack. I spend a lot of time in the stacks. Follow us, spread the word. No matter what else we try to do, we've even seen word of mouth is still our best form of advertisement. So I do sincerely hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you'll spread the word. Look out for our next broadcast tour. We're coming. Come join us some Saturday. And otherwise, thank you. Read a banned book. All right, with the. And I just don't want to. This was so much fun.